Hebrews 11 begins, "Now faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen." This is one of the most widely misunderstood passages of the Bible, and it's really important to have a proper grounding of what faith is. So today we're going to ask that question and try to get a really good answer. Before we start, please follow us to hear about our upcoming live streams and everything else we're working on. You can like us on Facebook, you can subscribe on YouTube, and if you hit the notification bell, you'll be notified when we upload new stuff. I'm Ryan Hebert from Meet Jesus. Thank you. If you're joining us live, please ask your questions in the chat box, or if you're watching later, leave your comments in the section below. Joining us today, we have Liz Jackson. Liz Jackson is an assistant professor of philosophy at Ryerson University. Her research focuses on questions in epistemology and philosophy of religion. Her dissertation was on the relationship between belief and confidence. Much of her research in epistemology revolves around the question of what should we believe. In philosophy of religion, her research focuses on the rationality of religious commitment, specifically the relationship between faith and reason and Pascal's wager. She completed her PhD in philosophy at the University of Notre Dame in 2019. Thank you for joining us, Liz.
Thanks so much for having me. I'm really excited for today and to talk a little bit about faith.
Great. Well, before we get started, I'd like to have a word of prayer. Make sure we have God involved in this. Father in heaven, thank you for giving us the opportunity to think critically about what it means to have faith. Please guide us so that we can find the truth wherever it leads and help us to understand reality that you created better. In Jesus' name we pray. Amen. All right. So maybe we'll start with the big question, and you can help us figure out how we want to divide it up and answer it appropriately. So what is faith?
Yeah, so faith is our topic today. And so I wanted to, start off with a distinction that I think is important for understanding faith. And I wanted to say too, I love how you open with that passage from Hebrews 11. So I want to bring into how some of the things going on in the philosophy world with the definition of faith actually relate to what it says about faith in that passage as well. So I just wanted to note that before I forget that I'd like to talk about that at some point. But the first kind of big distinction that I think is important when we're thinking about faith is acts of faith versus faith as kind of more like a mental state. So, people will talk about like taking a leap of faith or acting on faith. And that's a really important sense of faith, just faith as a way that we act. But there's also faith that's kind of more something that's in our heads. And so I like to think about that as, when you think about like believing something or desiring something, that's a mental state in your head. And so you can also think about faith in that way as kind of like a mental state. And I think one reason I wanted to start off with this distinction, because I think it's going to come up at a couple different points in our interview. But one reason I think it's important just initially is that what we should think and what mental states we should have and how we should act, or they're actually, they're subject to different kinds of rationality. So a lot of people think believing especially, but you can think about faith too. When we're thinking about them as mental states, we would think about them in terms of epistemic rationality, which has to do with kind of the relationship to knowledge and evidence. But when you act, a lot of people think that would be the thing that we would evaluate for practical rationality. So one reason it's important is there's two senses of faith, and whether each one would be rational would be a different question. So I wanted to sort of start off with that. I think that's an important distinction. Okay. So in my work, I do think about both senses of faith, but I do focus more on faith as a mental state. And that's partially because I work in epistemology. And so oftentimes when we're evaluating faith as a mental state, we're going to evaluate that in terms of its epistemic rationality. So when we think about faith as a mental state, I think most philosophers think, and this will come up in your second question too, but most philosophers think it has sort of two main components. And one is more of a belief-like component, and one is a more desire-like component. So I guess the first thing I'll say is It's weird to say that we have faith in something if we have no desire at all for that thing, right? So I'll give this example before, but if you're running a race and I say, I have faith that you're gonna, win this race, but I really hope you lose. I desire that you lose. That's weird, right? We wouldn't say that.
Yeah.
And so, and the same thing too, it's like if I have faith that God exists, but I think that would be a horrible thing and I want nothing to do with God, like that just doesn't make sense, So a lot of people think faith has some kind of desire-like component. And that would be a conative is kind of the big philosophy word that people would use for that, a conative component, but you can think about that as just this desire-like aspect to faith, right?
Okay,
but,
so you wrote conative, and I had to go look it up. I've never heard it before. I was like, is that a misspelling? Is that cognitive?
It's usually actually in contrast with cognitive. So there's conative and cognitive. So I put epistemic in the notes for the other component, but you can also think about that as cognitive. But yeah, conative and yeah, so maybe it's one of those things where philosophers will use these really big words for things, but really there's like epistemology, that's kind of a big word. They could just say knowledge, but instead they use a big word for it, So yeah, so conative you can just think about as desire-like, right?
Okay.
So that's one component of faith, is that it has this kind of desire-like, and you can also think about it too, it motivates us to act, right? So it's interesting because we are thinking about faith as a mental state, but that is connected to faith as an action, and I'm going to talk more about that later. So it has this conative component. But the other thing is, I think a lot of people think faith also has some kind of either cognitive or epistemic component. And what that means is that it is going to be sensitive to evidence. This is going to be sort of similar to like a belief-like state. So if you say, I have faith that you're going to win this race, but it's impossible for you to win, or, you're projected to lose, very, very, very likely, it's also weird to think that you would have faith for something that you either think is definitely not the case or almost definitely not the case, and so people think, also, to have faith, you need some kind of belief-like component, and then there's debate about what exactly that is, but you at least need some level of confidence that that thing is true, or maybe a belief that that thing is true. And this is going to be different than the cognitive component, because it's not just a desire for it to be true, but it's acknowledging there's some good evidence for this, or some amount of evidence that this thing will obtain. So you kind of need both of those components, at least when it comes to faith as a mental state. So yeah.
Okay. Well, that's great. So thank you for breaking that down for us. So what is there a big contention about what the definition of faith is, and how do people fall along these lines?
Yeah, I think that's a really good question, and actually a great one for an interview like this, because I think sometimes people like me will be like, here's how it is, but they're actually kind of saying their own controversial views. And I think it's good to kind of situate definitions, especially in terms of kind of how people view the concept as a whole, or in a more broad sense. So I would say probably the biggest controversy in the faith literature is the relationship between faith and belief. And so the big question is, does faith require belief, or does faith entail belief? So if you have faith that, so let's say I have faith that you're going to win this race. I keep going back to that example. Does that mean do I have to believe you're going to win? And so some people say yes, some people say no. I guess some people say the main reason people say yes is because they think there's something dishonest about it if I have faith that you're going to win, and maybe even act as if you're going to win, but I really don't believe you're going to win. So what would they would say that's kind of dishonest, or that's not really acting in the true way that you see the world, or the true way that you're representing the world. But the people that say faith doesn't entail belief will say that there are some times where we kind of have a commitment, and you could even think about like a religious commitment, a commitment to God, or a relationship with God. And you get really serious counter evidence that makes you really doubt that, does God exist? The problem of evil, the problem of divine hiddenness, these are real challenges. And so I've heard it called the path from doubt to getting out. And so they have these doubts, and then they just say, I can't genuinely commit to this anymore. So I have to leave my faith. I have to leave Christianity, or I have to leave, whatever. And so what people want to say, well, we can go through really serious doubts, but nonetheless kind of maintain our commitment to God. And I think there's different ways of spelling that out. But one way of spelling that out would say, even if you kind of dip below believing for even a short period of time, you can still rationally kind of maintain that commitment. But then the other side would come back and say, well, no, that's dishonest. There's a certain point at which you should give up your faith. And, they kind of go back and forth. So I think that's kind of a big controversy, is sort of the relationship between faith and belief.
Okay, I mean, and that makes a lot of sense. So maybe we'll move a little faster or switch things around. So one thing that you didn't really talk about here, is sometimes the question, is faith rational at all, or is it just the belief without proper evidence, or is that a reasonable definition of faith?
Yeah, that's good. And some people will even say that. They'll just say faith is just belief without evidence, or believing something that is false, or whatever. And so here's the way I like to think about it. So I definitely reject that way of thinking about faith. I don't want to say faith is just belief without evidence. But I also...
It sounds like that wasn't one of the ways that you think that's brought up in the literature either.
Yeah, philosophers almost never would define faith that way, even though people on YouTube might. So that's an interesting kind of important maybe differences. I don't think, at least most philosophers, some might, but most philosophers wouldn't say that. Would just be you wouldn't just automatically define it that way, Okay.
Well, I think that's helpful to clarify. All right. So
yeah, absolutely. No. Feel free to interrupt as much as you want. I love the discussion aspect. So here's the way I like to think about it. Faith can definitely be rational, but I don't think we should define faith as either rational or irrational. So I like to think about faith actually as kind of like belief, where you can have rational beliefs, you can have irrational beliefs, but we're not just automatically saying all belief is rational or all belief is irrational. So you might, a silly example is you call an Uber and you're waiting in the rain and it's been 2 hours and you're no, I have faith my Uber driver is going to show up. Okay, that's probably, you might have faith, but that's not rational. You should probably give up your faith at a certain point,
Sure, yeah.
But if, you invited your brother to come to your birthday party and you're really close friends and he's always come, you could totally have faith your brother would show up to your birthday party, and that's rational. You know what I mean? So I think there's just, sometimes faith is rational, sometimes it's irrational. And then the interesting kind of philosophical work is, well, when is it rational and when is it irrational? And I don't want to necessarily get into all the details here because this is probably a whole nother interview. And actually in some of my other interviews, we have gotten into all of this because that was just the main focus of the interview. But I actually have a paper, it's called The Nature and Rationality of Faith. And in that paper, what I do is I try to argue that for theists, and I kind of focus on Christians specifically, but it could be applied to other religions as well. Either your definition of faith isn't actually going to be irrational, or it's not going to be something that most Christians have. So, for example, you could just say, this is kind of the definition you suggested in your question. Faith is just believing something without evidence, right? And if we say, okay, let's just give you that, we can say that's what faith is. Then we have to ask the question, is this something that religious believers actually have? And then I give a bunch of reasons to think, no, they actually do have evidence when we have a good philosophical understanding of what evidence is, which is it's something that raises or lowers the probability of a certain proposition. So even if they can't give you scientific evidence for God's existence, there's a lot of evidence that goes beyond that, like testimony and experience. So that would be an example where, yeah, faith wouldn't be rational there, but we have no reason to think religious people would actually have faith in that case. And then there are other cases where, maybe religious people would have that, but that kind of faith actually turns out to be rational. So I can kind of point you to that paper if you're interested in hearing more. I probably go through 8 or 9 different definitions, but it's sort of supposed to be this bigger defense of this idea that religious people don't have a faith that is irrational. They either don't have the faith that you're talking about, or the thing you're talking about is actually rational. So
yeah, that sounds great, and I'm happy to post that in the description.
Yeah, that would be awesome. And I did an interview with Santi. I don't know how to pronounce his last name, but he has a channel called Finding God, and we actually went through like all of those in detail. So that would be something people could check out if they wanted kind of more on that. But it's just kind of this idea that religious faith, it sort of defends this idea that religious faith isn't irrational. So
That's great. Thank you. All right.
yeah.
So how do we get faith? How do we obtain faith?
Yeah. So I like to think about faith actually in both senses, in the act sense and in the mental state sense. And at least in many cases, as a kind of commitment that you make. So I think of faith as closely tied to a commitment. And so how we obtain faith is going to depend on the kind of faith in question. But I do think when faith is more of a commitment to act, what you do is you make a commitment to act in a certain way over time. So you could think about like a marriage commitment, for example. When you get married to someone, you're sort of committing to them that I'm gonna, be faithful to you. I'm gonna, have this relationship with you. I'm gonna trust you, and that's something that I'm going to do long term over time. So you obtain faith by making that commitment. And I think a similar thing, it applies to a lot of areas of life. Another example that people use often is the commitment to like finishing grad school. And you can actually think about that, some kinds of commitments, as faith in yourself. So you say, I'm going to make this commitment to kind of do my PhD. It's going to take 5 or 6 years. I know there's going to be hurdles and difficult points along the way. But I'm going to make this commitment and have faith in myself, but also, faith that God will help me through it, faith in my family, my teachers. So one actually active commitment could demonstrate faith in a lot of different kinds of people as well.
That's fascinating. So it sounds like, I don't know, sometimes I want to draw dissimilarities between common uses of faith and how faith is in the Bible. But maybe most of these uses of faith are pulling out certain aspects of a genuine biblical faith that we can understand in different contexts. And so they're not totally dissimilar, just we have to recognize how far the similarity goes.
Yeah, I think that's right. And one thing, so actually you had asked a few questions ago, what kind of controversies or contentions are there about defining faith? And one controversy there is just whether we can kind of give one single definition of faith, or maybe there's just a lot of different kinds of faith. And I personally think that we can at least say some things about faith in general that apply to both biblical faith and faith, just like, the faith that I would have in my husband or my mom or something, but there might also be things that are sort of unique to faith in God or even Christian faith that wouldn't apply in the case of, faith in my mom. And, that makes sense, right? God is a very different kind of being. And I think that warrants a different kind of faith and trust, even that would in a close personal relationship. But there is some similarities there too. It's interesting. Like, as we have faith in God and, maybe we see God answer our prayers, or we see like how we can depend on God, I think that can give us zeal to continue to trust God, maybe even to bigger things in our life. And I think the same thing could apply in a personal relationship. And that's kind of maybe why you get to know someone for a while before you would like make a marriage commitment to them, for example. So I think there's similarities, but also differences there. But I'm hoping that at least a lot of the things I say could apply to both.
Okay.
Yeah.
So, we've talked about having faith, and we kind of bring it back to people. Can you have faith in non-people and inanimate objects even?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I would think in some sense you could, but I think it would be kind of a more trivial sense and probably less connected to the deeper sense of faith as a commitment that we were just talking about. So at least in English, it's fine to say something like, I have faith that this chair will hold me, or I have faith that my car will get me all the way across the country or something. And this is faith, at least in the sense that you kind of have that belief-like state and you have that desire-like state. So you want the chair to hold you, and you think there's at least some good evidence the chair will hold you or something. But I think that's probably not the most central and important kind of faith The more central kind of faith is this faith that underlies our big life commitments, commitment to close family and friends, commitment to God, commitments that we make to ourselves, that kind of thing. And so I think it's interesting that in some, could you one interesting case I was thinking about actually when you sent me this question was religious relics. And I don't have a strong view of those, but some people might think that they have a stronger commitment like faith to a religious relic. I don't know. There's interesting debates there about whether that would be whether that's biblically mandated or not. But I think in most cases, probably we wouldn't have that stronger kind of commitment like faith to inanimate objects. Another case that I was thinking about too that might be interesting to think about is sort of faith in a concept or in an ideal. So faith in democracy or faith in world peace, or faith that we can ultimately come to achieve world peace or something. And so that's not really faith in a person, although it could be connected to faith in a person. But it's also not really faith in an inanimate object. It's kind of like faith in this ideal or this, I don't know. So that's kind of another interesting thing to think about. And I guess it's also worth noting that some people like to reduce certain kinds of faith to other kinds of faith. So they might say that all cases of faith that something will happen can actually be reduced to faith in a person or an ideal. So you might also say the faith that we would have in an inanimate object would be reducible to maybe a more important kind of faith. So
it might be important if you're talking with somebody to notice these times where they're using faith in different senses to try and make their own message, or to and it might be confused, and maybe there's something that can be worked out and clarified.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think another thing that's just important to think about too is some people will sort of attack religious people for having faith. But when you note that, faith is actually a really important part of our everyday discourse. And even if in some senses it's just this faith in a chair, kind of trivial thing, you also I would like to think most people think having faith in your spouse is really important, and not just in a trivial way, but in a deep way. And so I think that's something that you can actually kind of say when people attack religious people for having faith. I think we all have faith, at least in some sense, whether it's faith in those around us or faith in some kind of ideal. Maybe you would even have faith in rationality, faith in following the evidence. You think that's going to lead us to some kind of great world if everyone would just follow the evidence in a certain sense. So that would be sort of that third kind of faith, the faith in the ideal thing. But I think we all have faith. We all have things that underlie our life commitments and things that we kind of put our trust in. And so I don't think it's this special feature of religion where we just believe things without evidence. That's not how I see it at all. So
okay.
Yeah.
So is a personal relationship an important aspect of faith? It sounds like it kind of is. Can you help us understand that?
Yeah, that's a good question. So I would say we kind of talked about how there's a more trivial sense of faith, and that might just kind of be the way we use that word in certain English sentences where we say, I have faith this chair will hold me. But when we're talking about this faith that underlies our important commitments, I would say a personal relationship is at least almost always a very important part of that. You could debate about whether it would be always, whether if you have faith in democracy, does that reduce to something about personal relationships? I don't know. I guess that's kind of an open question. But a lot of the cases of faith, and when we think about faith, I think it's going to be connected to these personal relationships. And I think there's a couple cases that I think are really interesting to think about here that I thought I would at least explain. So one case that I think is kind of interesting is, let's say your brother's accused of murder, and there's some evidence that he did it, but not decisive evidence, So maybe he didn't have a great alibi, or, there's someone could come up with maybe some kind of motive, but you've also known your brother your whole life and you really trust him. And he's I didn't do it. I didn't do it. I didn't do it, And I think that's an interesting case of faith, because you could, if it was a different kind of thing, if it was a random person accused of murder that you didn't know at all, maybe you should not have faith that that person is innocent, But when it's your brother, I think because of that personal relationship, maybe you should have faith that your brother is telling the truth. And I think there's different reasons you can give to explain why that's the case. I mean, one just kind of really basic reason is just because you've known your brother so long and because he has that track record that we've been talking about. But I was also thinking too, sometimes evidence is really hard to weigh. Sometimes it seems like, and actually you could even think about sometimes when you think about debates for and against God's existence, what's going on is people are kind of weighing evidence differently. But sometimes it's really hard to weigh evidence, and it's not obvious that there's one way that we have to weigh evidence to be rational. And you might think that because in this case, it's not like there's, your brother his fingerprint was on the gun, and it's not like it's 100% sure he did it. But I think there could just be more than one way to sort of weigh this evidence. And because you have this personal relationship with your brother, that sort of allows you to weigh the evidence in a certain way that someone who doesn't have that personal relationship, they couldn't weigh the evidence in that way. So that would be a kind of different way of telling the story. But I think there's multiple ways of kind of explaining why this faith could be rational, even though, in the interpersonal case, you could have faith, and in the non-interpersonal case, you couldn't have faith. So I think that's kind of an interesting case. Another case I was going to talk about as well is it's a marriage case. So you're about to get married, and part of marriage is committing to, be together till death do us part. So be together your whole life. But then you learn the statistic that 50% of marriages end in divorce. So it seems like learning that statistic might actually kind of undermine your commitment, right? Well, if we only have a 50-50 chance, can we really make this kind of commitment to each other? And so I think that's another case where, connected to your question, sort of the fact that you have this personal relationship and this track record can make that commitment rational and underlie that commitment, even though you know the statistic in the back of your mind. But I also think, too, that there are these attitudes, they're called self-fulfilling attitudes. So they're attitudes that when you have them, they sort of make themselves rational. They're super interesting. But this could be a case where if you believe that you're going to be an exception to the statistic and that you have this kind of unique relationship that not everyone has, this unique commitment to each other, that can actually make it more likely that you'll make it through the hard times and make the probability that you won't get divorced higher. So actually having the attitude in and of itself either creates evidence or strengthens that commitment. So I know that was a lot, but I guess what I was trying to illustrate is I think personal relationships give us a unique kind of faith that we wouldn't have if we weren't in that personal relationship. And then B, there's also really interesting stories we can tell using tools from epistemology as to why that's actually not irrational.
Yeah, that's great. So you were talking about this marriage coming up analogy, and you've got this 50-50 chance. And you say, well, just the belief can actually strengthen the possibility. It seems like it also can be true that if you believe something and don't recognize the reality of it, you might miss important signs and have it go the other way as well.
Yeah. So if you are like, oh man, 50% of marriages end in divorce, we're screwed. There's no way we're going to stay together, and you almost give up before you start. That would make it more likely that you would actually get divorced and demonstrate a lack of faith. Oh, sorry. Did I misunderstand?
I was thinking kind of where you would believe that you're the exception, but then you would miss the reasons that seem to lead to divorce because you think you're the exception and you're not watching for it. So, you can have that belief and that faith, and you can do something rational with it, or that helps strengthen it, or you can do something that makes it more likely. It's kind of interesting that way.
Yeah, no, that's cool. So I think it's just true that people who automatically just say this is just an irrational thing, they don't realize that there's actually some really interesting tools in epistemology that can explain why this actually isn't irrational. So,
and I like how you're bringing it forward that faith isn't strictly rational or irrational. It's a different thing that we need to think about on its own terms.
And it can be rational and it can be irrational, but it's not right to say it's always one or the other,
Right.
Yeah.
So what is the difference then between faith and belief?
Yeah, that's a really great question. So I think there's at least two big differences, and some of this is going to be controversial, so I'll flag that as we go. But I think the most commonly acknowledged difference that I think most philosophers agree on is that faith, like we said at the beginning, has this desire for the thing to happen, right? So when I have faith, you'll win the marathon. I have to have some desire for you to win. And if I hope you lose, that doesn't make sense. That's not faith. But belief doesn't have that, right? So there's lots of things we believe all the time, every day, that we have no desire to be true at all. So I believe that there's a horrible war going on in Syria, or I believe that there's this horrible virus that's killing people and causing us all to have to teach online and do social distancing and whatever, And so I believe these things, but I have no desire for them to be true. But it would be really weird for me to say, I have faith that coronavirus is killing, thousands of people. No, you don't, unless you're an evil person, right? So belief doesn't have this desire component that faith does. One reason I think this is really interesting, though, is because faith involves both our beliefs and our desires. I think it can actually underlie our commitments in a really special way. And I think belief can underlie our commitments too. In most cases, when we believe something, we're going to act as if it's true. But because it doesn't have that desire component, it's not clear that it's going to be, so I'll say this. Oftentimes, when we act rationally, that's because we have some kind of belief and some kind of desire. So when we are hungry, we desire food, and then let's say we believe there's food in the fridge, so we get up and go to the fridge. What makes that action rational, going to the fridge, is both the belief and the desire. And so what's interesting about faith is that it actually has both that belief component and that desire component. And so this is getting a little more controversial, but I think it can kind of underlie these long-term commitments in a way that maybe just belief can't. At least not, it won't be as steadfast in light of doubts or counter evidence or whatever. So in a way, faith is more powerful than belief in that it's kind of more connected, I think, to our these commitments that we have. So I think that's kind of a cool feature. And then I guess the other thing that would be potentially a difference between faith and belief, it would just be related to that debate I was talking about earlier about whether faith requires belief or doesn't. So if you think faith doesn't always require belief, then you would say that there are cases where maybe your confidence goes down to the point where you can't believe anymore, but you could still have faith. So that would be kind of a potential second difference.
Okay. So in talking about the component of relationship with faith, and you talked about, your brother being accused of murder. You build up a relationship over time, and it seems like you internalize the character of this person. And so you have this maybe internalized reasoning. You have this experience, there's reason behind it, but when you're evaluating it on the basis of faith, it's not about all of the reasons particularly. It's about this relationship that has incorporated all of these experiences and all of this relationship. So then maybe it would be right to say that at least in that sense, where it's not the reasons directly, it's kind of an internalized version of the reasons that you had that were built up, that faith becomes, or faith is, the evidence that you're dealing with at that time.
Absolutely. So I think one thing that's really important that what you just said brings out is that faith is based on evidence, and faith isn't even necessarily opposed to this idea that rational attitudes are based on evidence. That's what philosophers call evidentialism, right? So in a lot of these interpersonal cases, we can give a full story of why that faith is rational with that faith being based on evidence, So I think one big misconception is this idea that, if you have faith, you have to ignore the evidence or oppose the evidence. And, that doesn't mean that faith would never go beyond the evidence in some sense, but I think it's really important to realize that faith is based on evidence and is sensitive to evidence. And you could say, look, you have faith that your brother is innocent because you've known him your whole life, and you have all this extra evidence that a random person on the street who just
Right.
reads about the case in the newspaper doesn't have. So I think that's really important.
And I feel like that's what this passage in Hebrews 11 is talking about, that it wants to let us know that this relationship that we can have with God, that becomes the reason that Abraham can do all of these things that look ridiculous. And he knew they were going to happen because he knew the person who was making the promises.
Absolutely. I totally agree. Yeah.
So you mentioned that you wanted to talk a little bit about Hebrews 11. What were you thinking of?
Yeah, totally. So I should actually so it was faith as evidence of things hoped for, the conviction of things not seen, something like that, depending on the translation.
Depending on the translation.
Yeah. So one thing I thought was cool about this is one thing it brings up is sort of the relationship between faith and hope, which I think is a really, really cool topic and something I'm really interested in. And one thing that I think is cool about both faith and hope is that, unlike belief, they both have this kind of desire component. And I actually think that's a really important part of Christian faith as well. And the book of James brings this out a lot. So in the book of James, they're saying, you believe, well, even demons believe, and they shudder. And what's kind of the difference? And one thing that I think is really cool about both faith in God and hope in God is I think it requires this desire for God to exist and for the Christian story to be true, and that you're seeing the beauty of this story, right? I think there's something really beautiful about this idea that God became a man and died for our sins. And I think one thing that's really cool about not just saying, I believe that, but something that faith and hope kind of bring to the table is they say, there's something really good about this. It's not just this thing I believe without any affection being stirred up. It's not just 1 + 1 = 2. I believe that that's true, but there's something that goes beyond that has to do with a desire for it to be true. So I think that's a really important part of faith and a really important part of biblical faith, and can even show the difference between someone who just maybe believes God exists and someone who actually has that commitment. And that's kind of that underlying desire for the Christian story. So I think that was one thing I wanted to say. The other thing I wanted to say, so faith is a conviction of things unseen. So this is related to distinctions that philosophers make between different kinds of evidence. So things seen, that's closely connected to what philosophers call empirical evidence, kind of like scientific evidence, but maybe a little more broad, kind of, I see my phone is on the table or my water bottle is on the table, right? And so I think one criticism that people will make of faith is that it kind of goes beyond that. Faith, people believe in God, but don't base it on scientific evidence, or don't, you've never seen God with your own eyes or touched God or something, and so it's irrational, right? But what I think is really interesting is that this is, again, based on this naive understanding of evidence, that all evidence is scientific evidence, or all evidence is just things you can see with your 5 senses. But that's just not true. So almost all of philosophy is based on what's called the a priori, which is things that we can kind of intuit or understand before experience. So how do we know that torturing a kitten for fun is morally wrong? A lot of people think that's not something you go out in the world and discover through scientific studies. You just kind of see that with your intuition. Similar to math. How do we know mathematical truths? It's not that we go out and do a study. There's things we kind of prove before experience. And so one thing I think is really important is that if you want to say all evidence is just this stuff that you have to see with your own 2 eyes, you're actually going to be ruling out not just religious faith, but all these other disciplines and morality and math and, most of philosophy, metaphysics, all this stuff. So one thing I like that this passage brings out is just that evidence is much broader than just things that we see with our own 2 eyes. And I think that's really important as well.
Yeah, that's great. Is there anything else that you would like to to point out or what
Yeah.
comes to mind?
I think that kind of covered most of the stuff that we had sort of planned to talk about. But
It did.
I mean, I think there's a lot of valuable projects in this neighborhood. I mean, we've been talking a lot about epistemology and philosophy, but there's also some really interesting things too, is like looking at pistis and how is that word used in the Bible. And I think it would be valuable to think more about, like we kind of alluded to this earlier, but the relationship between that term and then kind of our everyday English use of faith and how those relate to each other. And I know some philosophers have kind of worked on that a little bit, but it'd be interesting to see how is it similar to kind of our everyday uses of faith, and then how is it maybe different, or does it have like special qualities or characteristics? I think that would be kind of an important project that would be helpful for us to kind of understand Christian faith and then what that is and what it isn't. So
Yeah, that sounds like an awesome project. I'm really looking forward to seeing what you do in the future. I've been impressed with your work.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me on. And I love talking about this stuff. And I feel like in some ways we've only skimmed the surface. So
Definitely.
again, that one paper, The Nature and Rationality of Faith, I think is a good paper that kind of gives some definitions. And I would encourage people, if they're kind of wanting more, to sort of start looking there. But yeah, faith is such a great topic. And there's so much there, with both acting of faith and faith as a mental state. And, there's a lot of fun stuff. And one thing I'm actually hoping to work more on in the future too is some of my other research is on Pascal's wager, which is sort of this argument that it's rational to believe in God because you have a lot to gain and not much to lose. And so I'm interested in actually relating that to faith. So thinking about the way that someone who takes Pascal's wager might actually demonstrate faith. Maybe that's more of faith like an action, but I think it's interesting to sort of think about the relationship between those as well. So that's something I'm hoping to kind of work on, hopefully in the next year or so. Classes just started, so I'm doing some research, but now I'm kind of balancing that with teaching. So new projects are coming, but not as quick as they were when I was only doing research. But
Yep.
yeah, so that's another thing.
Well, thank you so much for joining us today, Liz. You
Yeah.
can find her at her website, liz-jackson.com. She's got a lot of great work. She's doing wonderful work. And thank you so much for joining us today. I'm Ryan Hebert, and more than anything, I want you to meet Jesus.